Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more attendees to turn up before we start, but welcome to all of those very prompt people. Whilst you're waiting, there's a little bit of a questionnaire quiz kind of thing for you to fill out and be really interested in your responses. And we're probably going to be starting in a minute or so, looking at the way the numbers are going. All right, team, I think we're going to make a start. So kia ora and welcome everyone to this webinar for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. We've got 4 really talented people here, myself included, coming to talk to you about the NCCRA, but I'm really the MC, and my job is just to provide the links and connections and have a look at questions that you may wish to ask and pass those on to the right people into the team here. In terms of who we have on the screen, with myself, Richard Ryan-Hamel. I'm the Sector Director of Tonkin Taylor for the Natural Hazard Resilience, and I was lucky enough to lead a really great team of people for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment Project as Project Director. We then have James Hughes. James Hughes is our Technical Director for Climate Change Resilience, and he was the domain lead for the built infrastructure for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment team. So looking at all of those climate change impacts on built infrastructure. Mahania Sweeney is our engagement genius for Tonkin Taylor, and she worked on the Maori engagement and partnership for the NCCRA. And lastly, we're really stoked to have Paul Evans, Chief Executive of the Association of Consulting Engineers. We've really been impressed with the way he is advocating and leading and directing the engineering society to be more engaged in climate change and resilience. So we're really pleased to have you on the team, Paul. So without further ado, we're going to have sort of a 10-minute presentation from James, Mahania and Paul. As you go, please ask questions, which I'll be looking through, and then we'll have hopefully a really good question and answer session following the presentations. So James, you're next.
Kia ora, thanks Richard. Appreciate that introduction. Good afternoon everyone. My name's James Hughes, as Richard mentioned, and I was lucky enough, or in some people's minds, drew the short straw in terms of leading the built environment domain for the National Risk Assessment. I'm just going to press forward. So the National Risk Assessment itself was the first time that this has been undertaken in New Zealand, as many of you know. It involved I'll just go through who was involved, and that includes ourselves. Tonkin Taylor was led by ACOM, involved NIWA, involved a range of other specialists from the academics and the university sector, as well as engagement specialists as well. So it's a massive team of people in a very intense period of work. The risk assessment provides a picture of how New Zealand may be affected by climate change over a range of time horizons, looking at the current time horizon, looking at 2050 and then out to 2100, and enables government to prioritise those actions. It also highlights key gaps in information. That's a key thing to note, and those can be used to do further research over time and to fill those gaps. Importantly, it doesn't deal with reducing emissions. It's only dealing with climate risk and how to adapt to those. So that big emissions piece and how we limit warming to 1.5 degrees is another key focus of the government and something that is being addressed through other channels. Also, it doesn't deal with transition risks. or socioeconomic implications or projections that might influence risk as well. So there's a few important things to note there. I just wanted to touch on a range of other, I guess, initiatives that have emerged over recent times and that are related to this risk assessment. So on the right is the climate change risk assessment report that came out. On the left is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the proposed mandatory climate-related disclosures that the government is looking at. And that will also relate to disclosing climate risks for certain sectors, likely to be private sector large investors, and that will have play a key role in managing climate risk going forward. Also, the slightly blurry picture in the middle is an announcement last Friday, which is guidance provided by the Ministry for organisations required to disclose risk as reporting organisations under the Zero Carbon Act. This is really a really important announcement and will relate to councils, government departments and lifeline utilities. And there's an estimate of around 600 organisations will need to report in some form on their climate risks. And they have suggested this is going to happen during August and possibly into September. So that's an important announcement. And down the bottom there, I've just noted a range of other, I guess, important linkages for people to understand. So on the left is the Zero Carbon Act. Again, as I mentioned, that has a very important role along with the Climate Commission. And I've noted the Infrastructure Commission there as well, which is playing a key role in taking a strong interest in this. And in the middle is the Controller and Auditor General. The Auditor General has released some very pointed and relevant guidance for councils and government departments on how they will be looking to assess how councils respond to both climate mitigation and adaptation within the infrastructure strategies and the long-term plan. So there's a lot going on here that's very relevant. Coming back to the National Risk Assessment, it's important that people recognise that when we frame this up and the risks, that we are cognizant of the uncertainty. And on screen you can see the 4 RCP scenarios. The National Risk Assessment looked at RCP 8.5. It also considered RCP 4.5. The RCP 8.5 is the red line, and I guess the uncertainty is illustrated also in this diagram by the blurry lines that you see behind those 4 average scenarios. And there are thousands of model runs that sit behind this. So the uncertainty plays a key role, and I guess is a key limiting factor or a key assumption that needs to be understood when we present and assess these risks. The RCP 2.6, I'll just note, is where we want to be heading if we're going to be limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. There are a range of hazards that were considered, and this just gives you a snapshot around rising seas, less snow and ice, stronger and more extreme events, changing rainfall patterns, etc. The approach that was taken, I'm just looking through there, so you've got on the left the assessment framework that was developed prior to the National Risk Assessment, and that guided the methodology that MFEs established in that process. So that was a key precursor step in leading to the National Risk Assessment itself. The middle box there highlights what the National Risk Assessment involved. So it was a key overview. It was a national overview of how New Zealand may be affected by climate change. It identified a whole range of risks, I think in the order of 45 in total, and then identified what those 10 top risks are, and I'll come to those in a second. And also highlights key gaps in knowledge and presents a range of reports that, if you're very keen, you can dive into the 200-something page technical report, which is a great read. Importantly, the National Risk Assessment will then inform the National Adaptation Plan, which is that last box on the right there, and is produced by the government over the next 2 years and will respond to those key risks that have been identified. The National Risk Assessment will be repeated every 6 years. The process that the risk assessment went through was a multi-stage process. So there was a first pass high-level screen of risks, largely undertaken through elicitation with a range of workshops around the country with key stakeholder groups, and informed by the various domain leads. And I'll just come to those domains in a second. well, I actually mentioned them now. So they are the built environment, the natural environment, human or social domain, including Māori and cultural impacts. There was the economic domain, and finally governance. So there were domain leads for each of those, so that those various risk screening and then into stage 2, the detailed risk assessment, were informed by both research and domain lead and input, but also for quite extensive engagement with the various sectors. And then that stage 2 was detailed assessment, and stage 3 was really refining those key detailed risks using methods for prioritising based on urgency. And we'll come to that very briefly soon as well. So those are the stages. Now, I'll just give you a brief overview of what those key risks are across the domains, and these are just some of the top ones here. So in the natural environment, the 2 key risks related to both coastal ecosystems and indigenous ecosystems across a range of climate hazards, including ongoing sea level rise, extreme weather events, and temperature changes. The human risks, some of the key risks include risk to social cohesion and well-being, and also a risk of exacerbating or creating new inequities between vulnerable populations. Key risks in the economy domain included increasing general economic costs to government in particular, but also to a range of sectors, and a broad risk around financial system instability. In the built environment, which is what I was primarily involved with, the key risks there were to potable water supplies from drought, but also from extreme events, and also generally to buildings, the built environment, and communities, and I guess particularly in the coastal environment, but also in floodplains as well. Interestingly, there was a big focus on governance risk, which was led by Judy Lawrence, and those governance risks, I guess, are cross-cutting across all domains. And some examples of those are risk of maladaptation across all domains due to the application of practices, processes, and tools that do not account for uncertainty properly. So as I mentioned earlier with that RCP diagram, there is a lot of uncertainty, and we need tools and methods to help us deal with those and plan accordingly. The second governance risk was that institutional arrangements are not fit for purpose. And that's a really, I think, increasingly well understood one. And we were talking about this earlier, but the lack of joined up legislation across our planning instruments, for example, the RMA, the Building Act, Civil Defence and Emergency Management Act, coastal policy statements, etc. They all are slightly disjointed in what they're asking for. So there's some real gaps there, and if they're not joined up, we're not going to be able to adapt in a timely manner. When we looked at decision urgency, there were 4 key areas, and this is important just to give you guys I guess a sense of how this was undertaken. So there were 4 categories. Those that are at the more urgent end were defined as more action is needed. Those also were, I guess, a subset of that was more action needed, but specifically around research. Then there were the less urgent ones, which was we can sustain our current action, and then there were at the bottom there the ones that we might have a watching brief on. So some examples of those risks that were identified that needed more action urgently were economic costs and liabilities from extreme events, and also gradual climate changes. The potable water risks was one I mentioned that was urgently needed further action, and risks to social cohesion as well was rated very highly in that top category of urgency. Ones that had a focus on research priority, so it was agreed it was a high risk, but further work to understand that risk better were, for example, risk to Māori and European cultural heritage sites, but also risk to landfills. Now, most of us are aware of some of one in particular on the west coast of the South Island, the landfill that was washed out. And there's ongoing studies that are trying to understand where those risks might occur around New Zealand. So that's a good example of where further research and evidence is needed, but it was still classed as a high risk by the various sectors. When we look at the built environment risk, which I was involved with in more detail, some more detail on those I'll talk about just briefly. So the most significant ones were, as I mentioned, the risk to potable water supply and to buildings and communities. That risk to potable water supply applies to both the availability of water around the country and also the quality of that water, through whether that's degradation of quality through, say, extreme temperature and algal blooms, or degradation of quality through extreme events and sediment runoff or runoff from catchments, etc. And again, buildings and communities around the country, particularly in coastal environments, are exposed to sea level and coastal inundation challenges. Other risks in the built environment domain include, as I mentioned, landfills and contaminated sites. Impacts to wastewater and stormwater systems was a key risk. Risk to ports and associated infrastructure, risk to transport networks, both road and rail, airports, and finally electricity infrastructure. And interesting on the electricity one, the general view from the sector was that the risk was higher for distribution and transmission infrastructure as opposed to the generation infrastructure, given their projections for rainfall and snow melt, etc. in the South Island. They felt that those were of concern, but were manageable over the long term. And just, I guess, by way of example here, I just wanted to maybe drill into a bit of a case study around the water issue. And from a New Zealand context, that issue of potable water security, particularly in droughts, is something we've experienced recently, both in Auckland and in Northland and around the country, and something that I think generally we're expecting to worsen. Interestingly, since 2014, around 50% of councils have reported, on average, some form of water restriction being implemented in their councils. That's quite a staggering statistic I found. That's from the Water New Zealand Performance Review report. So 50% of councils, on average, are reporting some form of water restriction they've had to implement over the last 6 years. A lot of councils don't currently meter water, which is a key way to sort of manage and control water leakage and water demand. It's another interesting fact. And I guess we're addressing, governments and councils are looking to address this, and it is well understood. Again, though, droughts have other cascading and interacting risks that are important to understand. So droughts can lead to more favourable conditions for algal blooms, a key risk that was noted, which can have impact, again, on surface water takes, and the interaction between the drought conditions and that water quality in those receiving environments is a key consideration. Also interacting risks, I guess, over the long term relating to drought might be the fact that we could implement more frequent water restrictions in cities and towns, leading to potentially higher prices for water. Who knows? And that might lead to economic impacts, social impacts, etc. So it's important we understand the cascading implications from some of these risks. So that's a very brief overview of some of the key risks from the built environment and more broadly. I just wanted to spend the next few slides talking about what this might mean for others and how you can maybe use some of these findings and to drill into more detail both for councils and for private organisations and utilities. And at a high level, what I guess I would encourage councils in particular to do is to try and integrate their approach to climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, into their overall vision and outcomes that they seek. And that particularly means aligning it with, for example, their 30-year infrastructure strategy, their spatial plan, including how they manage natural hazards in development, their civil defence and emergency management plan, their financial strategy. So all I guess, initiatives and plans that councils create and use to define their future growth needs to be integrated with climate change. And then when you move into detail on the right-hand side there, it's talking about firstly developing a solid, coherent climate change framework and policy, understanding gaps, particularly around adaptation and resilience, and building a knowledge and evidence base to then implement adaptation. That knowledge and evidence base effectively means understanding your risks. So that's where you need to do your risk assessments or have a methodological process to understand, rate and prioritise risks, similar to what the National Risk Assessment has done, but drilling into a high level of detail at a business level or at a council level. And then number 4, as I said, implementing your adaptation approaches. If you're a company, the approach might be slightly different and the language is slightly different. And I mentioned earlier the mandatory financial disclosure proposal that the ministry has. That follows something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Big word, but the acronym for those who are interested is TCFD. And that process encourages companies to look at both physical risks and transition risks. Transition risks are those that relate to transitioning to a low carbon economy. And if you follow this diagram from left to right, understanding your hazards on the left, then you move into organizational value chain risks, but you've also got macro environment risks at the bottom. And those can lead to secondary risks, such as liability, credit, liquidity risks, market risks, etc., and ultimately affect financial impacts and balance sheets. So I guess the detail is in these second 2 boxes around those organizational value chain risks and drilling into those at an appropriate level of detail that informs a company's particular responses, whether that's risk to supply chain, its operations and assets, its logistics, or the market in general. So that's a way of looking at the propagation of risks, if you like, through a company's value chain. When you're looking at risks, there are some really good principles, I think, that are useful for setting out an approach. And that needs to be tailored specifically to the context. So as we've spoken about, there's a national risk assessment at a very high level. You might look at risks at a sectoral or a council or regional level. Or again, as I mentioned, at an industry or corporate level through such processes as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The process must recognise uncertainty, it must be transparent, and it needs to involve all stakeholders and partners, and cognizant of the level of detail or the level of granularity which is appropriate and achievable based on the data that's available. And that's a key lesson from the National Risk Assessment is, in some cases we had good data, in others we didn't. We had to rely heavily on subject matter expertise. So in closing, I've just sort of given you my view here on what I think some key principles are for assessing risk, using, I guess, that really important high-level overview that the National Risk Assessment has provided us into drilling down into your own organisation. And that might be, number 1, factoring climate risks into all decisions. Base your decisions on local data and evidence and guidance that is currently emerging from government. Cooperate and collaborate across all sectors and all your partners. Take a strong view of stewardship and kaitiakitanga and precaution in how we deal with these risks. I mean, that's really important. Prioritise the most vulnerable in your communities. Take a long-term adaptive view and look for actions that have multiple benefits and look for quick wins or advancing those actions that have low regrets. I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much, and I'm going to pass over back to Richard. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, James. And I'm looking at a fair number of questions coming up, which James will look at in the discussion time. But with no further ado, I'll pass on to Mania.
Thanks, Richard, and kia ora, everyone. As Richard mentioned, I was part of a small team working on Māori engagement as part of the NCCRA process. It was led by Sir John Clark and involved other professionals from NIWA and elsewhere. So this is just some commentary, I guess, on the lessons learned and the takeaways around that and what it might mean, both from an iwi perspective and then some observations across stakeholders and community as well. So just to go back a step, communities, stakeholders and iwi are going to be central to advancing the next stages of how we respond to climate change. And over the years, we've seen some guidance come out from MFE around what this should look like. So we've got there the coastal hazards and climate change guidance documents right through to the national framework and the risk assessment itself. So I just want to take you back to a couple of diagrams that are probably familiar to you. This first one, the 10-step decision cycle. The planning wheel effectively shows how we understand what's happening, the identification of risks and issues, through to how we develop our responses and strategic plans for these. But what's important about this diagram is that community engagement is shown and required at every step of that process to inform right through to adaptation planning and strategic responses, and right through to evaluating whether what we're doing is working or not in the monitoring and the evaluation. So the diagram is circular, linking from evaluating back into our understanding. Another diagram that you might be familiar with is the spectrum of participation. So this is an adapted version here, showing the desired outcome of engagement interactions depending on what your promise is to certain stakeholders or community groups. So these range from the informing, providing information to stakeholders, progressing through to greater and greater levels of involvement and expectations through to full empowerment, which ultimately gives decision making to those who are being engaged with. Now, ultimately, engagement should be a planned process with the purpose of working across organisations, partners, stakeholders and communities to shape our decisions or actions in relation to climate change. And more often than not, we've found that while we might be engaging with one group or an industry group, like James said, there's often not a one voice represented, and that can sometimes be hard to negotiate. I've also found that spending time around how you are going to engage, so the process of mapping out what the objectives are, both the outcome orientated objectives, you know, what you need, through to the experiential outcomes objectives in terms of what the stakeholders or the community or iwi need, really needs the investment of time. It ultimately leads to increased participation in the process itself. And sometimes I think that we underestimate the work and the benefits that can come from that stage of the engagement process. Engagement in climate change is also really challenging due to the complexity and uncertainty. So most standard council infrastructure asset owner engagement processes have clear and outcomes in sight, you know, or certainty around what the engagement is seeking to address. So this might look like engagement on resource consents, a new seawall, to protect private or public assets against coastal erosion. And so the engagement outcome around whether that seawall should happen or not is the end in sight. It might be engagement to inform long-term plans or plan change processes. And all these processes tend to use elicitation or gathering of information through standard processes, public meetings, submissions and hearing processes. But due to the uncertainty that sits in the climate change conversation, this really requires a different approach and engagement because the insight's uncertain, the outcome is uncertain. So it requires a different change in the nature and frequency in how we engage. It requires a greater thought in terms of what pre-circulation of information might be required, what level of evidence might need to be presented, as well as how that information is actually handed over to stakeholders. So the NCCRA, it highlighted that to move our communities towards climate change engagement requires a mindset shift, both in terms of how we engage and how communities and stakeholders participate in the process. It requires a long-term view with many decision-making points along the way to adapt and respond to issues as they develop. Developing responses to climate change is highly specialised in itself, and so engaging with communities early can't be underestimated. Be tempting to commission technical reports in particular areas and take the informing approach, but there's a lot more benefit around a collaborative engagement approach that addresses risk assessment and adaptation and ultimately allows for greater solutions to be created over time. The diagram shown here, again, it's from the Treasury's Living Standards Framework for Wellbeing, and it touches on the wellbeing across the four capitals, the natural, human, social and financial capital. But it's surrounded by Te Ao Māori concepts of intergenerational sustainability, so kaitiakitanga, whanaungatanga, connectedness and relationships, prosperity, ohanga and manaakitanga, all of which I'll talk about shortly, to feed into the well-being of an individual, an environment, an asset, and the well-being. And I might just touch on some key learnings from in the Mātauranga Māori and Te Ao Māori space. One of the key learnings, the first learning that we took away, was that there needs to be structure and position risk assessments and responses within a Māori framework for Māori to be able to participate fully. So the current NCCRA framework is not part of a Māori framework, and so the relationship between domains, their risks, and the application of Mātauranga Māori was really challenging. The risk assessment itself was identified by many iwi as out of step with Te Ao Māori, and that it wasn't centred on the interconnectedness and interdependencies across the domains that James mentioned. So while the NCCRA is just the beginning of an ongoing cycle and review in response to climate change adaptation, the approach of splitting the assessment across 5 domains and proceeding in a linear fashion through a 3-step process wasn't really seen as representative of the cyclic nature of how climate change evolves from a number of iwi. I guess aligned to this, we also heard that the concept of risk itself is not a concept that's consistent with Te Ao Māori. The dynamic and ongoing responses to a changing environment, definitely, but not risk as it sits within this rigid risk framework across those 5 domains. So there's a lot of work to do around understanding how we might undertake risk identification and prioritisation with within a Māori framework, which is ultimately up to iwi, hapu and whānau to create. There are several models sitting across sectors that have tried to apply a Mātauranga Māori intersection with Western science. One of the well-known models is Sir Mason Drury's Whare Tapa Whā model, originating in the health sector. So this incorporates the 4 pillars of health to evaluate the overall well-being of an individual. So the evolution of a Māori framework for risk assessment could take Māori principles or mātā pono in a similar way to build a way of evaluating the health of a climate. So the NCCR framework identified a number of the principles, some which are shown on this diagram here. The concept of manaakitanga, kaitiakitanga, whanaungatanga, prosperity, and rangatiratanga, so the ability to exercise leadership and autonomy, and framed them all here under whakapapa, so that inherent genealogical connection which links a person with their place and their ancestors. So of course, one of the challenges that will evolve is to build such a framework will be to centre it in Te Ao Māori and not recentre it within a Te Ao Pākehā or Western approach. But somehow there'll need to be a way to concurrently bring 2 different approaches together to move forward. And one of the second learnings was that building blocks of iwi are made up of local and regional understandings of their rohe or area, and that starting at this level is really important. So the NCCRA set out how Mātauranga Māori includes information from a particular iwi or hapu that might be sacred to that iwi or hapu, and it's up to them to share. And how they share that and who shares it, whether it's elders, rangatahi or youth, or those with mandate, and how to share it in the appropriate forums. And often this process isn't clear. And so there are differing views that we heard around how that might be negotiated. This also raised the tension of achieving a pan-Māori perspective on national risks for New Zealand versus regional and local perspectives on more local and climate risks and opportunities. We heard really strongly at a national hui that brought together iwi from across the motu that evaluating national risks assumed this one voice, and that in practice it just wasn't the case. Sometimes it was due to some iwi being more advanced than others in developing climate strategies, while others are still at the start of their journey. Some are resource or capability constrained, others are balancing more pressing issues within their region. And so this meant that iwi had not had the ability to collectively come together in any sort of national process, and that they needed to start locally and regionally as building blocks to be able to have that broader conversation around what's important. I think now that that's probably even more amplified with a lot of resources locally and regionally needing to be redirected in response to the COVID pandemic. So the challenges at a local and regional level will be about negotiating those overlapping iwi interests and the misalignment of iwi boundaries and local council boundaries, and ultimately how roles and responsibilities are set to implement climate responses. And finally, the third learning was about targeted investment into how Māori concepts could unlock a way forward for climate change, particularly between iwi and treaty partners. So there was a general consensus that investment in more discussion about Māori concepts could unlock a way forward, and Mātauranga Māori could help drive that approach with Crown partners. So some Māori are already heavily investing for planning and responding to climate change independently, and they are in practice using Mātauranga Māori to advance those discussions around what's important to them, their whānau and their hapu. Waikato Tainui, for example, and their 2050 strategy have identified pathways to move forward. Equally, Ngaitahu has a standalone climate change adaptation strategy in place and includes a vision for all of their interests, assets and activities in their rohe. So the next step is how to invest collectively so that iwi and treaty partners can more broadly come together for leveraging that in a collective way. Finally, from me, engagement for climate change is still a new space for everyone, for central governments, councils, communities and iwi, and I think this is going to mean that there's going to be ongoing uncertainty about how to move forward, how to make decisions, and where roles and responsibilities sit around taking action. And so to negotiate this, I think one of the fundamentals is to go back to first principles, focusing on things like equity and fairness, both in terms of the process for engagement and the outcomes, focusing on things like inclusion to help then forge that trust that's going to be required to negotiate the challenges we're going to face. And ultimately, you know, that's good engagement across the spectrum to help us collectively determine our future. And back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Mania. We're going to go straight on to Paul to make sure that we've got enough time for a conversation after this. So, Paul.
Cool. Kia ora ngā mihi nui kia koutou, everybody. My name is Paul Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Association of Consulting and Engineering, or ACE New Zealand. It's always a little bit daunting going after a couple of technical specialists like James and Mania. I'm not a technical specialist, so I won't endeavour to replicate what they've done. I'll also try and ensure that I don't duplicate any content. But I think for me, the NCCRA is a really important first step in making Aotearoa more resilient. I think a quote that really stood out for me in the document was that it said quite unequivocally, it said, New Zealand's climate is warming, sea levels are rising, and extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and severe. Now that's really simple, but it's also really important because I think despite the overwhelming scientific evidence, I still see a pretty significant number of heads in the sand, particularly in the political realm, be that central or local. And then obviously it went on and it spells out the implications of those changes, you know, things like wildfires and extreme storms are going to become more common. Significant amounts of coastal property could be inundated by rising sea levels. And one which really stood out to me, and I think one that lay people like myself probably don't think about, is it could have a really big effect on social cohesion and our financial system. And, you know, think about whole communities having to be relocated, or Māori being forced to relocate from their whenua. that has a real impact on well-being, but can also, exacerbate further inequalities. And I think at a financial level, it's a systemic risk that, if left unchecked, could devastate both our local but also the global economy. The report looked at things like the insurance sector, saying it would be unable to affordably insure huge amounts of coastal property. That means banks could see their assets damaged by extreme weather events, could mean overall disruption to supply chains, which has knock-on effects from there. And I think to paraphrase Minister Shaw, I think he said something along the lines of, communities are already experiencing the effects of climate change, but that doesn't mean our goal of preserving a safe future climate isn't within reach, because, it really is. But he did go on to say that, cutting emissions is obviously a huge part of this. However, the climate is already changing, and there are some things that we just can't avoid. So while that transitioning to a zero carbon Aotearoa, staying within 1.5 degrees of warming is super important, government and communities need to be far more resilient to the unavoidable effects. So for me, the risk assessment helps the government to prioritise those actions, because I think it's fair to say that this is something we've been collectively talking and thinking about for a very long time, but our action to date has probably been a bit piecemeal, not part of a more holistic and strategic approach. So I'm really hopeful that the adaptation plan, which will come out, I think, August 2022, there's some really clear thinking around how we respond. Now, that adaptation plan will have some really significant implications. It's going to be really important that government works closely with iwi and local government in particular, but also broader society. And it also has massive implications for my sector in terms of consulting and engineering. We as a sector, as a profession, really need to ensure that we have our heads around this, because we provide advice and services into government, into iwi, and into the private sector. And we have, perhaps more than any other sector, the ability to shape what tomorrow looks like. And oftentimes, we might also be, and this is kind of picking up some of the stuff that Mania talked about, be responsible for elements of consultation and engagement, where we really need to consider how do we do that in a genuine and inclusive way, which is free from unconscious bias, particularly given the far-reaching implications of what we're talking about. So I think circling back to a local government lens, I think this will be hugely valuable. I think up until now, it's been a long time, over a decade since I worked in local government. But local government has always been between a rock and a hard place. You've kind of been a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't. And there's a bunch of examples of where that plays out. Now I'm mindful of time, so that's probably enough from me for now, but really keen to dig into things in a little bit more detail in the Q&A portion. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Hey, Paul, thank you very much for that. If we can probably get, thank you, the team up. And I guess following on from Paul and some reflections and the National Adaptation Plan process coming in 2022, I urge you not to wait for 2022 before thinking about the National Climate Change Risk Assessment outcomes and the risks that have been identified. There is a lot of information in there. And if you aren't thinking about what you can do now, I think we really have to start now. There's urgency, in fact. Enough information for both local government, central government, and communities to understand, A, what the focus is of the government along those key priorities, but also those lists may resonate differently at your local or your own sphere. So understanding that kind of process and mapping it across your areas of interest or need is really important. So it gives you a bit of a guide and a bit of a tool to identify areas that you can think about. And what we can also expect in 5 or 6 years, hopefully, is a much more, or maybe a different framework that integrates the Mātauranga Māori and the Western view to a more sophisticated and meaningful risk assessment. So I would like to see that change as well. We've had a number of questions, and thank you very much for those coming through. We've got a couple. So Fraser, you've had a few there in terms of the first one was, how do you see the role of legislated lifeline utilities consistently fulfilling their reporting obligations under the new climate change risk assessment? And there was a number of questions relating to reporting and consistency of reporting. And I'm guessing the Act is going to give some structure to that. But James, have you got any views on, I guess, reporting standards or frameworks? There are certainly under the TCFD, but they're still in development from my understanding. I mean, that we're still working out how best to do this.
Yeah, I agree, Richard. I think there's going to be, given the announcement last week on the reporting requirements, there was a one-liner in there that said the government will issue further guidance, and there needs to be a degree of consistency. In saying that, however, good practice for risk assessments exist within the asset management sphere, the natural hazards area, and I think the infrastructure kind of domain, if you like, is probably the easier, if you like, domain to put some kind of coherence around. It's because of the kind of built, the bricks and mortar nature to it. So,
and there is an ISO standard as well, and coming
exactly.
up as well. So, but
yeah.
I guess one of the challenges, and I think worth not forgetting, and there was a question there about buildings and that's being the biggest risk, is probably the biggest risk is in the environment, affecting the environment that we live, and that's why things like potable water and what we stand on, live and breathe. And that's where I see councils having a really important voice for the environment, which may not have the same, I guess, number of people advocating for it. And what I found really amazing in the NCCRA process was Maori really get that. It is all interconnected, and it's the environment that needs to be sustained and maintained to allow us to thrive.
Yeah, I'll jump in there as well because I agree, and I think Mania and Paul, you might have views, but it was interesting in the process of ranking risks. This assessment for the NCCRA didn't really consider cascading risks explicitly. It identified some interlinkages, but as a result, so many of the environment risks, and this was a very ongoing and detailed debate during the process, the environment risks were rated lower generally than the built environment risks in terms of urgency, in terms of consequence as well. That, I think, potentially doesn't reflect that they underpin many of the other risks that cascade from them. So how and you're dead right, and how we kind of reconcile that without getting ourselves bound up in very complex assessment processes is a challenge, I think. Mani, I'm not sure if you've got views on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, James, and just the and Richard, I think you're right around that Māori view and being able to leverage that, and somehow it's taking principles like kaitiakitanga, and I'm not sure whether there's an ability to be able to articulate that in a way that helps with prioritization and put another lens on those types of risks. So I'm not sure whether they become elevated or just giving greater conversation to the interdependencies that exist.
Mania, do you want to just jump onto Emma's question on the long-term conversations on how to have that longer-term conversation rather than what's immediately on the horizon, such as a short-term erosion response or a long-term plan commitment? So how do you get that longer-term view baked in?
Yeah, I think that's where process is really important. So being able to have decision-making points along the way, and I guess this is where the conversation around dynamic adaptive pathway work and pivoting and moving at certain decision-making points over time helps to negotiate a more long-term engagement process. And that helps for communities to see the pathway into the future as well, even if it's not aimed at an outcome of sort.
Thanks for that, Marnie. And there was a comment in the questions regarding uncertainty. So just having a look there in terms of, from Rob Deacon, the biggest barrier to climate change risk is uncertainty, understanding the options. I think one of the things with climate change is we know it is happening and it will happen, exactly when. So I think moving from a time-based to a trigger-based kind of understanding and developing adaptation options when certain scenarios are met is a really useful frame, rather than saying we'll have something by 2080 or 2090. So I think that trigger is important, and that adaptation response. And for me, the giving communities that we live in confidence that whilst we might have big uncertainties on what the possible future may bring, that we have a plan that has thought about those various trajectories or pathways, and we know what will happen when something reaches those triggers. So I think that planning process, considering that range of possible options and thinking about what our response is at different triggers is will help give communities confidence. And I also think it probably requires leadership from councils themselves to start thinking about how those consequences feature in their plan process, and even with designations for changing things at certain times down the track, and having provision for that, so that there is more confidence and certainty of the process rather than what may happen with the climate.
Richard, I'd agree, and I just think that the leadership component is so key, and it is going to, over the next 10 years, we're going to see, a lot of test cases. We ultimately live in an environment, a built environment that is slab on ground, stuff that's very difficult to adapt to. So we have to somehow make some really tough decisions, and it will be the test cases that you're talking about that will set some precedents for how we might respond. Paul, you might have some views on that as well.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes when people talk about leadership, they automatically look at local government, right? And local government should do this, or central government should do that. I actually think our sector, in terms of consulting and engineering, have a really critical role to play in terms of challenging these things and ensuring that clients and communities are aware of some of these things which are really inconvenient, right? But we need to really put these things forward strongly. We need to make that case. I always kind of say, if we know something, then if we tacitly accept the status quo, we're culpable in the outcomes. So I think we need to show professional leadership there as well.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just looking at David Bert's question. Hi, Dave. And he's saying that obviously the NCCRA had a broad scope, how to implement it when the stakeholders and local authorities in Mana Whenua are resource and financially constrained. And I think that's a really good point of how to integrate our understanding of climate change and its consequences into existing processes. So this is actually part of our life, and integrating it into plan changes, integrating it into your asset management plans, and having that as a function, I think, is a way of socializing and making it real. It isn't something you have in a separate folder sitting on the other side of your desk. It's actually integrated into all of the decision making that we make through processes. And Paul, you made a point that resonated to me about leadership and not looking to government or local government for answers. There's a lot of information out there, and everyone can make a start or take some leadership in what they're responsible for, and I think that's really right. So for me, that's hence my call of not waiting for 2022 to see what pops out. Actually, there's enough sitting here in the NCCRA to make a really good start. And there was a question on tools and available at a local level from Jan. James, you want to take that one on?
Yeah, g'day Jan. There are a range of tools. Look, I guess if you're referring specifically to risk assessment tools, there are a range of those out there. There's no standard So the National Risk Assessment Framework as a methodology is being, I guess, modified in practice at the moment in various instances at a regional level. So a bunch of regional councils are looking at applying very similar frameworks. I guess there's various levels of applications. There's, if you're looking at, I think my earlier point around risk assessment, around the context is critical. A tool that might be fit for purpose and an approach at a national level isn't going to work if you're assessing risks to electricity networks in a certain area. So it's kind of something that's fit for purpose. The other point is, I think, around tools such as Richard alluded to, the dynamic adaptive pathways approaches that are useful tools and frameworks for working with communities where there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly in a coastal environment. But for other climate hazards, I think it's increasingly being tested as well, that type of approach.
And I think the process, like that wheel that Mania talked us through,
yes,
from the MFE guidance, is a really useful process for following. And the other thing, and I guess the process through the risk assessment for the NCCRA was much more about elicitation from various stakeholders and interest groups, rather than sort of that traditional get lots of asset data, throw it through a risk assessment kind of process. All risk assessment methods, like through elicitation, judgment, and with the communities, right through to those sophisticated, or not sophisticated, number crunching, big data kind of analysis, they're all valid, but all of the outcomes need to be tested, and they give you information that you have to consider and adjust. So they're not the answer. They give you some ideas which you then have to refine and feedback loop and discuss with those affected stakeholders or parties. Now, I'm conscious that we are just about out of time, and there's a few more questions that are popping up, which I really do appreciate. What I may do is, when we complete this, maybe add some of those questions or responses at the end. But I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the people who have invested their time into this webinar to come and listen. We really do appreciate that. And to Mania, Paul and James, thank you for your responses.
Sure.
Thank you, Richard.
Good afternoon.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, everyone.